Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Order Sons of America, a pioneering Mexican American civil rights organization that would go on to be one of three organizations that merged to form the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, in 1929. Tonight, Dr. Cynthia Orozco, preeminent scholar of Mexican American civil rights history, will share the story of the OSA. But before that, we have a few special guests with us tonight. Joining us from Dallas, Texas, where he formerly served as a city council representative and a state representative, I would like to introduce the national president of LULAC, Domingo Garcia.
Thank you, and buenas tardes, noches, wherever you may be here in the country. I want to welcome everybody to this really important historical moment in time. My pa always said, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. And the Order of the American Sons is one of the founding organizations of LULAC. Today, LULAC stands as one of the preeminent Latino civil rights organizations. But it started right there with the founding of this organization and eventually the merger of three organizations in Corpus Christi that created LULAC as we now know it in 1929. But the battles that we're fighting to make sure that Mexican Americans and Latinos were represented at all levels, whether that be on a jury, whether that be the right to vote, whether that be ending the segregation in the schools, or the no Mexicans, no Negroes, no dog signs that were prominent throughout the United States and especially in Texas. Now, those are the battles that they fought. And they were courageous men and women, many times facing overtly hostile and racist actions, whether from the Texas Rangers, local business, and law enforcement. But they still stood up and said, we're Americans, we deserve and believe we should have the same opportunities as everybody else. And I always encourage everybody that as little kids, we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And it ends with liberty and justice for all. These men believed that all included Mexican Americans and Latinos in the United States. And they lived that legacy, and it continues today. Who would have thought that an organization founded in the 1920s would continue into 2021 and still be relevant, still be important, and still be on the front lines of the civil rights fights that we have today, whether it's now voter suppression, gerrymandering, or dealing with issues such as COVID and its impact on the Latinos in the United States, or providing political and economic opportunities for everyone, as well as in education and criminal justice reform, as well as those immigrants who are coming across the border and looking for LULAC to be their voice as they try to make and find their way to the American dream. So muchísimas gracias. I appreciate the work that all of you are doing. Dr. Orozco is one of the preeminent historians about LULAC and about Mexican American history in the United States, and you're in good hands. Muchísimas gracias. And congratulations on the 1 year anniversary and birthday of the Order of the Sons of America.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce from Houston, Texas, the LULAC Texas State Historian, David Contreras.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gould. It is indeed an honor to participate in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Order Sons of America, which many historians believe to be the birth of the Mexican American civil rights movement in the United States. Founded on this very day, October 13th, 1921, in a barbershop in San Antonio, Texas, the Order Sons of America merged with two other organizations in 1929 to form LULAC. This evening, we are honored to have as our guest speaker Dr. Cynthia Orozco, one of the nation's foremost academics, historians, and authorities in the history of Mexican American social and civil rights activism. Dr. Cynthia Orozco is an award-winning author, historian, public speaker, and a member of LULAC Council 120 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Texas, Austin, and her master's and PhD from UCLA. She is a two-time Ford Fellow and is a professor of history and humanities at Eastern New Mexico University in Ruidoso, New Mexico. She has written more than 80 encyclopedia articles for the Handbook of Texas. and over 100 articles and letters for newspapers in Texas, California, and New Mexico. She is the author of No Mexicans, Women, and Dogs Allowed, The Rise of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, about the origins of Lulac, and the University of Texas Press best-selling academic book between 2010 and 2020. She is the author of Agent of Change, Della Slothvento, Mexican-American civil rights activist and Texas feminist, which won the Liz Carpenter Award for Best Book in Texas, Women's History in 2020 from the Texas State Historical Association. Her book on the principal founder of Lulac, pioneer of Mexican-American civil rights, Alonso Perales, will be available this November. Lulac brothers and sisters and others who are attending, please welcome Lulac's preeminent historian, Dr. Cynthia Roscoe.
David, thank you very much. And thank you, National Lulac, for having us and all of us on this historic occasion. Also, thank you to the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute based in San Antonio for attending to this important event. And also thank you for inviting AARP and all the folks connected with that organization for being here as well. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the rise of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement and how the Order Sons of America, also referred to in Spanish, Orden Hijos de America, created and began what we call the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. Before we get into the details of the Order Sons of America, it is first important to talk about what we mean by a social movement. And basically, we're talking about a collective group of people with a shared collective identity who begin to participate in efforts to change the status quo. And these are people who typically have some kind of shared identity, and that is really what constitutes a movement. And really, you need a sense of urgency. And I will go on to explain why folks felt there was a sense of urgency. I want to say that I reject reference to what is sometimes called the civil rights movement, because typically when we talk about the civil rights movement, it is colored Black. And we know that there have been numerous people of color civil rights movements. And tonight we're going to focus on the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. Also, I should say that when we're talking about this Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, there were a handful of Latinos involved. Of course, in San Antonio and Texas in the 1920s, there were not many, but a few did participate. I also want to say that while I'm primarily going to talk about the 1920s, I should mention that there were important predecessors before. We have had mutual aid societies, also called mutualistas, at least since the 1860s. In San Antonio in the 1920s, we know that over 10,000 people were involved in these mutual aid societies, and they were the most common form of organization that folks were involved in. I should also say that we have historic participation in labor unions dating back to the Knights of Labor in the 1860s. Also, we were involved in the American Federation of Labor since the 1890s, although that labor union privileged skilled workers. We have also been in the IWW, the International Workers of the World, a more left-leaning type of union. And we have also participated in other groups such as the Partido Liberal Mexicano, particularly in the 1900s and 1910s, which was more of a leftist leaning type of organization. However, we're going to really start our story tonight in 1911, because in 1911, there was a historic conference sponsored by the Nicasio Ida family of Laredo. And that conference was organized to fight lynching, which was a continuing problem, but there were several very gruesome lynchings that occurred around that time, and there was a major conference to address it. So we will start with 1911, but we will also continue with 1921. I also want to say that at the national level, this is really the first reference that we see by Mexican Americans referring to themselves very overtly as U.S. citizens. It's also the very first reference to the U.S. Constitution. But I also do want to mention that in Arizona, the Alianza Hispano-Americana, a mutual aid society, also had begun some of these efforts in the 1890s. There were a few organizations, a few chapters throughout the U.S., but it never became as strong as Lulac would become. Again, the Primer Congreso, really the first major Congress or conference, really, it's really a conference, and that's really an important distinction. It's a conference, but it never became a permanent organization. Again, it was organized to fight lynching. We know, again, by 1960 in Texas, at least 600 persons had been lynched, people of Mexican descent. And again, so lynching was not simply a Black issue, it was also a Mexican issue as well. They also organized increased school segregation. And what we saw in Texas was after the 1890s, we saw the beginnings of what we now call a tripartite school system that was segregated. And so we began to have what were called Mexican schools. And these became prominent all throughout Texas and even increased in the 1910s and 1920s. The Primer Congreso was also bothered by what they considered to be the deterioration of the Spanish language. So again, Necaso Ida and his family, his son Clemente, son Eduardo, and daughter Jovita were all involved in these efforts. About 300 people attended this event from Texas and even from Mexico. They were primarily male. Jovita Ida was actually one of a few women that were there, again, at this time period throughout the United States, especially in Texas, and definitely amongst the Mexican descent community. Gender segregation was quite common. Now, one of the obstacles to continue in an organization was the problem of transportation and communication. And it really would take World War I to begin to create better roads throughout the entire United States and better communication systems, including the telephone. So these were major obstacles, not to mention money and the fact that the people who would have attended this 1911 event would have been more middle class and more privileged. They could get away from work to attend such a meeting. Now, in the 1910s, we continued to see racial violence. Again, I mentioned lynching. Also, we also had a major development in South Texas that has now been labeled La Matanza, or the massacre, the killing in South Texas between 1914 and 1919. Estimates range that 300 to 5,000 persons of Mexican descent were killed, some of them by the Rangers. We don't have a count because they were simply Mexicans, considered Mexican bandits. The dominant society did not care. The Mexican community was mostly disempowered at this time. Again, I want to bring attention to the fact that in the 1910s, in all of Texas, in the Texas legislature, we had only one Tejano state legislator. So we did not have political power in the 1910s. Also, I want to bring attention to what we call the Porvenir massacre in West Texas along the border, where 15 men were pulled out of their homes and killed by Texas Rangers and other officials. The 1920s saw a continuation of racial violence, a little bit less, but still, nonetheless, it existed. In Ranger, Texas, for example, 600 persons of Mexican descent were run out of town. And I should also remind folks, in the 1920s, we saw a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan with over 300 chapters in Texas. So again, this really was a very racially difficult time, lots of violence throughout the 1910s and 20s. Again, I mentioned that World War II really was an important event in our community. Again, the war started in 1914, ended in 1919. The U.S. entered around 1917. We did have Latino participation. Even Mexican immigrants were allowed to participate, and nobody asked them to not participate. So they did die for this country. I also want to mention the important name of J. Lou Saenz, who was in World War I and who wrote a diary and later published it as a book in 1933. And he became one of the major founders of Lulac. So looking at San Antonio, we see also a very dismal situation. In 1910, the entire population there was about 53,000. But by 1930, it was up to 231,000. And by 1930, we La Raza, the Mexican descent and Latino community, were 82,000, or about a third of the population. Again, most of that because of the Mexican Revolution, also because of increasing immigration, much of which was allowed at the time. Also in San Antonio, we see that it is a major transportation hub. We also see the development of military bases, and this does a number of things. Number one, it provides jobs, but it also instills even more U.S. patriotism in the folks that are in the San Antonio area. Culturally, again, we have the Mexican Revolution from 1910 till about 1929 or 1930, and we really do see a re-Mexicanization of San Antonio. Again, with this increase of population, also the founding of an important newspaper, La Prensa, in 1913. The Mexican and Latino community is increasing and becoming even more Spanish-speaking. At the state level, we see that San Antonio is very important. It is larger than Dallas, Houston, or any other place at the time. And nationally, it has the largest Mexican population in the United States. It's not Los Angeles, it's San Antonio at this time. So then if we were to look at the conditions in San Antonio, we would also find a very pathetic situation. We would see that throughout the 1920s, there were no elected persons of Mexican descent at the county or local level, I think with the exception of the sheriff. Besides that, there were no elected officials. There had been a long history of what we call political bossism, and I should also remind folks that we had the poll tax throughout the South, dated from 1903 all the way till 1965, so you had to pay to vote. Likewise, we had the white primary that existed, and that died for some Mexican Americans in the 1930s, but continued on for African Americans until a lawsuit in the 1940s. We also had racism by the political parties. Nonetheless, we did have a few people of influence, men of influence in particular. In San Antonio, we had Francisco Chapa and also the Pablo Cruz family. I might also mention, as most of us know, that Mexican American women were not able to vote until 1920. So that was another disempowering factor to consider. And actually, some Mexican citizens were allowed to vote up until around 1927 or so, because in some places it benefited the political parties to allow Mexicans, but after 1927, no Mexican citizens were allowed to vote. And then again, I mentioned that J.T. Canales was the only Mexican American or Latino state legislator between 1910 and 1920. So you can see the political situation was very bad. Looking at the social situation, we see institutionalized patterns of racial segregation and exclusion. The worst of these, of course, were the schools. Again, we see the existence of escuelitas, little schools created by the Mexican community to uplift and educate our own community. But from the dominant society, again, we see more and more separate, segregated schools with inferior facilities, low funding, teachers that are not qualified, lack of books, and inferior facilities overall. Again, the pattern of Mexican, anti-Mexican signs are increasing. The no Mexicans or dogs allowed signs are becoming more prominent. They're very common at restaurants. They're common at hospitals. They're common at hotels. So if you were driving around or trying to get a meal, you were not always ensured that you would be able to eat. And in addition, within our own community, again, I mentioned that we are experiencing a re-Mexicanization of San Antonio at this time. Looking at the economic situation of our community between 1910 and 1930, really, we do not have an upper class at this time, and we have a small immigrant middle class and a small emerging Mexican-American middle class. This middle class hardly has any professionals. It has some small business owners and artisans, but mostly our community at this time is a working class community, many who are farm workers, others who are laborers, and of course, we also have the emerging pecan industry and other things of that nature. Wages are low, and wages are race defined, and they are gender defined. And basically, promotions were extremely rare. So we have a suppressed working class community for the most part at this time. Educationally, as I mentioned, we do have the escuelitas, but we do have a rise in school segregation. College graduates were extremely, extremely rare. If you look simply at UT Austin in 1928, there were only 57 Spanish-speaking persons that were attending the college. The norm actually is third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade for most in the 1920s. Again, unfortunately, we did not have the same college experience of historically Black colleges. We did not have any colleges that we created or that anybody created, so we were unable to develop a significant and intellectual class the way that the African American community was able to do so. So again, education really was not very advanced. It would have been rare to find somebody with a high school degree, and even worse for college. Again, in this time, we also see the rise in the dominant society of what they call the Mexican problem. And we know ourselves that we are not a problem. We are an asset to this community and to the United States and to the state of Texas. But politically, we were seen as ignorant people who were subject to the patron and were subject to the commands of the Pope. Economically, we were seen without any kinds of class differentiation, seen as poor and destitute. Socially, we were seen as dirty with our heads full of lice and often portrayed only as criminals in the press. And culturally, we were seen as a problem because they believed we did not want to assimilate and we were simply loyal to Mexico. So those are the general conditions that existed at this time that would give rise to the Order Sons of America. Before I continue, I want to mention, if folks are interested in conducting more research on the Order Sons, to tell you how we know what we know about the Order Sons. First of all, we do have the newspapers in Spanish, La Prensa and La Época, that are available, and those are now, at least La Prensa is available on, most of it is available online. Also, fortunately, we have some old records, and I was fortunate to benefit from Professor and Dr. Jose Limon, who actually gave me a copy of the Constitution of the Order Sons of America. And without that Constitution, we would know very little. Also, I want to mention and thank Ruben Bonilla, who during the 50th anniversary of Lulac in 1979 made important efforts to get key documents into the library. So we have the Andres de Luna papers, which included the minutes from the Order Sons of America in Corpus and Alice. So those are important records. Unfortunately, there are no Order Sons of America records for San Antonio, original records. And unfortunately, it looks like at that time or even now that archivists were not looking for materials locally. Some of them have gone to Austin, but locally, San Antonio needs to do a better job to collect those records. I should also add that since I began my studies as a sophomore in 1978, I was fortunate to interview both John Solis and MC Gonzalez. John Solis being a major founder of the Order Sons, and MC Gonzalez being a major founder of Lulac. Those oral histories are now located in Austin with the Voices Oral History Project, so they can be seen there. I also want to mention that my first book, No Mexican Women or Dogs Allowed, really is the best source to read very broadly about the Order Sons. Now, the Order Sons began really at a barbecue, okay? And as we know, barbecues, especially in this time, were places where mostly men would hang out. But there were 7 or 8 individuals, the most important being John Solis, who was a World War I veteran. And they hung out at in elotes at the ranch of somebody named Lorenzo Morales. So for about a year, there were about 8 men who met informally: John Solis, Pablo Cruz, Leo Longoria, Francisco Leighton, Melchor Leighton, Abraham Armendariz, Vicente Rocha, and Mercy Montes. 3 of these men were veterans, and they talked about the problems that they were facing. So finally, after about a year, they decided to get a few more people involved in San Antonio, a few more people that had more education, that were bilingual and could help facilitate better organization. Now, I understand that there was a flood in San Antonio in 1921, and I am now thinking that the fact that more than 700 to 1,000 people from the west side died in the flood, that might have been a precipitating event that even further mobilized these folks to move as the Order Sons of America. Now, I should also mention that here is where Clemente Ida from Laredo plays a major role, because we do find his name on the Constitution of the Order Sons of America of San Antonio. Now, let me read to you very briefly the first Declaration of Principles from the Order Sons of America. And it reads, "We declare it the duty of citizens of the United States of Mexican or Spanish extraction to use their influence in all fields of social, economic, and political action to secure the fullest possible enjoyment of all rights, privileges, and prerogatives granted to them under the American Constitution." So you can see reference to the fact that they are emphasizing citizenship. They're also emphasizing rights, and they're also emphasizing the U.S. Constitution. That same document also refers to the OSA as a national organization. So there was the vision there that eventually became Lulac to make it a national organization. I should also mention that this Constitution is 45 pages. So this is not an organization that anybody planned for it to fail. 45 pages is quite significant. It was printed in both English and Spanish. Now, it's interesting that the Constitution actually suggests that the Order Sons is going to be a civic group, a political group, and also a mutual aid society. And it's a little bit of all of those. They do emphasize the problem that farm laborers and tenants are having. They also talk about assisting folks regardless of citizenship. They also talk about the need to abolish child labor, and they talk about racial prejudice and discrimination. And they also talk about establishing cordial relations with Mexico. And they suggest that there should be local councils, including ladies' auxiliary councils and juvenile branches. Now, what we do know is that San Antonio, at least what we know right now, women did not organize any kind of auxiliary to our knowledge. But in Corpus, we did see a separate organization called the Alpha Club that women were involved in, along with the Order Sons there. So finally, on October 13th, there was the founding meeting. And again, this was located on Flora Street in San Antonio at the barbershop of Ramon Carvajal. Ramon Carvajal's name also appears on the Constitution. He was a barber, a reportedly very well-read barber, and I'm assuming he was also bilingual. Selected as president was Santiago Tafoya Sr. Yes, this is a grandfather of Dr. Carmen Tafoya, very well known in San Antonio. He was an interpreter for the district clerk. So really, in the entire city of San Antonio, he probably would have been one of the major key political players in the city. Also, we see as vice president Feliciano G. Flores, who was a policeman. And then we have some other folks involved. As treasurer, we have Ramon Carvajal. Excuse me, as secretary, we have Ramon Carvajal. Now, the Order Sons, as I mentioned, intended to be a national organization, but really it became only a South Texas organization. So we had chapters in San Antonio, Somerset, Pearsall, Corpus Christi, Alice, Kingsville, Beeville, and Uvalde. And those were the chapters that were founded. Now, unfortunately, the Order Sons of America had some problems, and again, various records say different things. But some people suggest that Tafoya had an inclination toward politics, maybe using the membership for voting purposes. Others say that Tafoya wanted to control the presidency. He actually was president in San Antonio throughout the 1920s. And really, when you think about it, convention. So while they were successful in creating local chapters, there really was nothing that was unifying them. And a critic of the Order Sons would later come into San Antonio, Alonso Perales, and would critique the organization and provide alternative ideas for organizing. Now, in San Antonio, we saw some of the splinter organizations because the San Antonio group did not stay intact throughout the 1920s. Shortly after it was founded, it splintered. One of the organizations was called Club Protectora Mexicana. We also had another group called the Order Sons of America, Order Sons of Texas that came out of the OSA, and then yet another organization called the Order Knights of America. So all of that was before 1927. We saw the splintering in San Antonio. Now, in San Antonio, nonetheless, all of those different groups were able to do a number of different things. They helped to obtain a pardon by Governor Ferguson of a man who had been wrongly charged. They also took up a major murder case. They also protested segregated schools in Converse, Texas. They protested segregated restaurants in Devine. They cooperated with the Mexican consulate, who was an official representative of Mexico in Texas and in San Antonio and other places. And they also promoted the poll tax and talked about their legal and civil rights. Now, we have much more information about Corpus Christi, again, because we have the minutes, the secretary's minutes, mostly Andres Luna, who recorded what happened, and therefore we have detailed knowledge about Corpus, much more than San Antonio. Corpus was actually organized, and then it fell apart, and then John Solis from San Antonio went down to Corpus and reorganized. And we know that they used to meet at the Lozano Woodman of the World Hall on Staple Street, and they were quite successful in a number of different programs. First of all, they helped to obtain the first Mexican-American on the grand jury, and they wrote letters and communicated with different legal officials to do so. They also protested a swimming pool there that they helped to desegregate. They also countered discrimination on the beach at North Beach in Corpus. and they helped to create a new Mexican school. While they were not able to get rid of Mexican schools, they got a better school. And they also sued a white landowner, or helped somebody sue a white landowner for wages that were owed $700, which would have been a lot of money in that time. They also were active in helping to create the Alice and Kingsville councils and communicated with La Raza in Robstown, Bishop, and Victoria. So you can see that Corpus Christi also had an important reach and an important South Texas reach. Now, the splinter groups, as I mentioned, were the Club Protectora Mexicana, the Mexican Protective Club, the Order Sons of Texas, and the Order Knights of America. Some of the key persons, especially in the Order Knights of America, was John Solis, who we see again. So he was dissatisfied with the OSA. M.C. Gonzalez, Manuel C. Gonzalez, who was probably the second or third Tejano lawyer in the state. Okay, now the first Tejano lawyer would have been J.T. Canales. Again, he was a state legislator in the 1910s. He obtained his law degree at the University of Michigan in 1898. So there were not even lawyers that were available to help people protect their rights. Another important person with the OKA was Mauro Machado, who was a clerk and would also go on to become a national president of Lulac. And also Eleuterio Escobar. Some of you in San Antonio know him because he is affiliated with the School Improvement League that organized under the vestiges of Council 16 of Lulac in the early 30s and went on to make a major impact to build decent facilities on the west side for the Mexican descent community. As I mentioned, there were a number of problems with the OSA. It seems like Tafoya was a control freak. He also seemed to have a penchant or an interest for getting the membership involved in politics, or at least that's what he was charged with. He also seemed to not want to let go of control to get San Antonio to maintain control. And again, there was really no state umbrella organization that was created by the Order Sons of America. So then we see that what happened is that there were these problems in San Antonio, but lo and behold, around 1922, 1923, a man named Alonso Perales returns to town. He was originally from Alice, Texas, had worked in San Antonio right before he got drafted into World War I, and he had attended a business school in San Antonio, so he had white-collar skills. He could read and write English and Spanish. He knew shorthand typing. And then after he finished his stint in World War I, he went on to Washington, D.C., worked with the Department of Commerce, finished his high school degree, continued on, got a college education, and became a lawyer. So he was either the second or third Tejano lawyer. Well, he was in contact with folks connected to the Order Sons of America. And so he had his own ideas as to how, what was wrong with the Order Sons of America and how to improve it. So when he did finally return to Texas, he first returned to the Valley, was employed by J.T. Canales in Rio Grande City. And in 1924, he and J. Lou Saenz, again, who was the veteran who had written the book, the diary about World War I, they organized conferences and lectures, particularly in South Texas, south of Corpus, about the need to organize and form a strong permanent organization. In 1927, they helped to organize what we now call the Harlingen Convention. And again, men were invited to that conference. No women were invited. Mutual aid society members attended. And one of the issues that they dealt with was the question of citizenship. And should Mexican immigrants be invited into the organization that they wanted to form? Mexican immigrants were denied inclusion into the organization that they immediately founded, the Latin American Citizens League, really, which was a valley organization, Rio Grande Valley organization with a number of chapters. Finally, in 1929, Perales and others had been talking about this question of unification. And this is why when Lulac was created, when it was finally founded in 1929, the word united is in its name, because we see the unification of some, but not all chapters of the Order Sons of America, and definitely not San Antonio. So San Antonio OSA did not join Lulac. Again, probably because Tafoya thought, well, we were here first, Perales is too young. Some of you folks are newcomers, we have experience, but he did not want to let go of control. So most of the Order Sons of America, the Order Knights of America from San Antonio, and the Latin American Citizens League, LAC, from the Valley, organized together, and they founded Lulac in 1929. So again, sometimes people ask about the Mexican exclusion. And let me say that what most folks are not aware of is that in 1924, the United States created the Border Patrol, and citizenship began to matter more and more. I should also say that many folks here were Mexican Americans. They were US citizens, and they were becoming more incorporated into US society. They were bilingual. They wanted to assert their rights as US citizens, and they felt that had they included Mexicans in their organization, most of those people would have said, well, we were going to go back to Mexico. They would have also addressed problems and questions in Mexico. Again, we know that the Mexican Revolution was highly contentious with many, many factions. And there would have been argument after argument. And really, most of those Mexican immigrants did in fact end up staying in the United States, and actually their children became Mexican Americanized over time. Again, we also know that class was a major fracture point within the Mexican community. Probably the vocal folks that would have joined a group like Lulac would have been the Mexican intellectuals, middle class, perhaps not even thinking about the lower class or working class's interests at the time. And think about how also Mexican immigrants did not organize an alternative to Lulac. They could have been empowered to do so had they believed it was necessary, important, or if they had had the means. Again, remember that the majority of Mexican immigrants would have been workers, working class, unable to speak English, not particularly well educated. And we know that Lulac never did abandon Mexican immigrants. Mexicans were always part of the focus of Lulac. Again, let's also very briefly address this question of gender segregation in the Lulac organization. When Lulac was founded in 1929, there were no women included. They were not invited. Nonetheless, we do know that women attended the conference, most of them probably as wives. Nonetheless, we know that Mexican American women were also interested in civil rights. Again, we know there was a dominant pattern of gender segregation. For example, the Mexican consulate in San Antonio and elsewhere throughout the state and nation created separate organizations for men and women. The men were involved in the Comisión Honoríficos, or honorific commissions. The women were organized into Cruz Azul. This is still the 1920s, whether it's people of Mexican descent, Texas, or the United States. It's still a major period where there is no major feminist movement. Women are supposed to be in the home. Women have barely received the vote, and it's really white middle class women that are mostly active in advancing those questions at this time. So let me conclude and let me say that the Primer Congreso Mexicanista was an important conference, but it was hindered by transportation and communication, and therefore no permanent organization remained. I should also say that Clemente Idad was the key transition figure, writing probably most of the Constitution and inserting pro-labor and mutualista themes throughout the Constitution. The Order Sons of America was the first permanent civil rights organization in the United States, but its leadership and constitution had limitations. The Order Sons of America expanded at least to 8 towns in South Texas. And while the Order Sons of America of San Antonio did not join Lulac, they provided an organizational base that eventually gave rise to Lulac in 1929. And let me say, lastly, Alonso Perales provided the critique of the Order Sons of America and the leadership to improve what the OSA began. And he is the true initiator of the Lulac organization, founded in Corpus Christi in 1929. And it was Perales, not Ben Garza, who is the true founder of Lulac. But without the Order Sons of America, in 1921, before Perales, we're not sure if we would have Lulac today or not. Thank you.
Dr. Orozco, do you want me to put some of these pictures up?
Yes, let's go ahead and start with the first slide. Okay, so here we see, again, here's just the title of my presentation next. And we're going to go on for about how many more minutes?
You can take as much time as you need.
All right. Okay, so here we have Nicasio Ida from Laredo. And if you look closely, you can actually see that he's a Mason, and some of the symbols on his sash suggest that. Next. Here we have a picture of La Crónica. The Ida family had several newspapers. This was one of them in 1911, and it is from this newspaper that we have knowledge about the Primer Congreso. And again, a good shout out to Dr. Jose Limon, who did the original research on the Primer Congreso in the 1970s when he was at the University of Texas. Next. This is a picture of Jovita Ida from Laredo. She also was active with the family and also attended the Primer Congreso. She and other women helped form a local feminist organization. But really, we see that Jovita Ida was in San Antonio in the 1920s, but did not work in any form with the Order Sons of America, to our knowledge. Next. Here we have a picture of the Texas Rangers during what we call La Matanza. Again, you can see that they are posed and proud to have killed Mexicans who they believe probably are bandits at the time. Next. Here's a picture of J.T. Canales when he was a young man. He served 3 or 4 terms as a Texas legislator. And in 1919, he brought formal charges against the Texas Rangers, which led to not their disbanding, but to reform to make it a more modern and less racist organization. Next. Here we just have a picture of World War I, which is a massive global event. Again, we can barely imagine the extent of this global war and global terror. Next. Here we have a picture of the book that J. Lou Saenz wrote. It's called The Mexican Americans in the Great War. This was published in 1933. It has since been translated and is available on Amazon. Next. This is a picture of J. Lou Saenz. He is from Rialitos, Texas. He was a teacher, highly respected. He was often referred to as profesor. He moved from town to town because he would be fired since he was protesting racism and segregation. And he is, again, was active with Perales, organizing the conference in various lectures in 1924. Next. Here we have a picture, supposedly, and I haven't tried to verify that this is 100% real or not, but it does say no dogs, Negroes, Mexicans. This would have been typical at the time. This is from Dallas around 1942, allegedly. Next. And again, this is another picture. This one was taken by Russell Lee, a photographer in San Antonio in the early 1940s. The reference to Spanish is the fact that you had the Canary Islands there, so they wanted to make sure that they were included as well. Next. Here's a picture of John Solis, and again, he's really a major mover and shaker. Perhaps we would have no Order Sons of America and no Lulac without John Solis. Next. And he was a vet, as I mentioned. Next. Here's a picture of Santiago Tafoya in San Antonio. He was both with the Order Sons as well as president of Mutualistas. Again, these are folks who are completely bilingual and bicultural. And you can see it looks like an American flag and probably a Mexican flag to the left. Next. Here we have a picture of Clemente Idad. As I mentioned, he's connected to the journalist family of the Idads in Laredo. He's also a major Mexican-American labor organizer for the AFL. Very, very intelligent. If you look closely, you can see that he has a couple of fingers that have been cut off, and he was known to be an expert orator as well. Next. Here's a picture of Manuel Gonzalez. He went by MC Gonzalez. He was probably the third Tejano lawyer, a major mover and shaker. He had already been involved in the 1910s with a protective organization and a major leader, and became a national president of Lulac in the early 1930s. Next. Here's the one of the rare pictures we have of the Order Sons of America in Corpus. I have not located an Order Sons of America photo of San Antonio. So they're at a parade here. Next. Here's Ben Garza. He was a restaurant owner. While not highly educated, he was highly intelligent, a mover and a shaker, charismatic. And he was considered a compromise candidate, and that is why he became the first national president of Lulac. Next. Here's Andres de Luna, recording secretary. He kept wonderful minutes. Without him, we probably wouldn't be able to have this discussion tonight. Next. This is the Wilmot couple, Ofelia and Luis Wilmot in Corpus. He was active. I met him in the 1970s. He was active in Lulac all his life. Ofelia also was active with women. Next. Here we have the wife of Ben Garza. He died of tuberculosis. I think it was either tuberculosis or diabetes in the 1937 or so. So we were not able to benefit from him very long, but this is his family. She was also involved, as I mentioned, with the Alpha Club, and then later Corpus Christi women also formed Ladies Lulac. Next. Here we have from the newsletter of the Order Knights of America, their symbol. Again, the idea is to protect and serve, and that is why we see the shield continued on in Lulac to this day. Next. Here's Mauro Machado, a clerk, also became a national president of Lulac. Next. Here we have two pictures of Eleuterio Escobar. He was a World War I vet. And then, as I mentioned, even outside of Lulac in the 1930s and 40s, he went on to fight with the School Improvement League. Next. Here we have a picture of Alonso Perales, a very unique man. because he was born, and then his parents both died, so he was an orphan. He should have been homeless and depressed and remained at the bottom, but I believe he's the most important Mexican American of the 20th century. Next. And here's a picture of Adela Sloss, who contacted Perales when he was in Rio Grande City in the Valley. She was already 26 years old when she finally graduated from high school and became a civil rights leader and activist of her own. She did not join Lulac, but nonetheless fought for the same causes. Next. And here we have the founding convention of Lulac in 1929 in Corpus. Alonso Perales attended the February convention, but there's no picture of that. So Perales is not in this 1929 photo of men that founded the organization. Next. Here again, we have the Lulac emblem. So again, the idea of the shield is to protect and serve. Next. Here we have the second national convention in Alice. It was originally slated for Laredo. There were some problems between some Lulacers and Clemente that he actually was asked to leave Lulac. And so the conference was held in Alice instead of Laredo. You can see that women are in attendance here. Next. Shortly after Lulac was created, from 1931 on, they created Lulac News, which was a brilliant idea. The idea was to reach people through the mail, and local councils would ask local businesses to pay for the ads, and it moved from city to city. And that is why and how Lulac could survive the 1930s and beyond. Next. And I just have listed some of my credits, this one and the next one, please. Next. For anybody that wants more information, the most detailed account of the Order Sons of America and the founding of Lulac is in this book, published in 2009, No Mexican Women or Dogs Allowed, The Rise of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. Next. This is a book that I published last year called Agent of Change, Adela Sloss Bento, Mexican American Civil Rights Activist and Texas Feminist. I was fortunate that I met her in 1978, 1979. She allowed me to use some of her papers. That's how I learned about the Harlingen Convention of 1927. And her son, Dr. Arnoldo Carlos Bento, allowed me to use her papers so that I could write this more recent book. Next. And this is the forthcoming book on Alonso Perales. It's about 500 pages. It is a very detailed biography of a very important man, the major founder of Lulac, public intellectual, attorney, diplomat, and civil rights activist. Next. If you want quick information, I suggest that you go to a Texas history encyclopedia called Handbook of Texas. I have written numerous articles there. You can either use my name or you can type in the names of people or organizations you're looking for. Next. And then finally, if you need to contact me, I do have a website, and also I have email and a phone number. So feel free to call me or contact me. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orozco. That was so much great information. One question I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned earlier on, well, how do we know about this history? And you mentioned La Prensa, and you also mentioned La Crónica in Laredo. Just a little bit about what kinds of things the newspapers reporting on, these Spanish language newspapers, was it simply announcements about these things, or were they actually saying what was happening?
Well, all kinds of things. The Spanish language press goes back several centuries, okay, or definitely into the beginning of the 1800s. But in San Antonio, there were newspapers. One was called El Regidor in the 1910s. In 1913, La Prensa was founded, and it would last until the early 1960s. There were, I'd say at least 30 or 40 persons who worked there. We have a photograph actually included in the Agent of Change book. So it was a transnational and a transnational paper, meaning that they covered events in Latin America as well as Europe, and I don't think any other continents, but definitely those places. It also reached throughout the United States, but especially in Texas. They reported, they had reporters, but people also reported their events to La Prensa. La Prensa was really the major organ or newspaper for the Spanish-speaking community for decades.
We have a question from the audience about, do you know if there have been any studies on the kind of psychological impact that the kind of terrorizing that Mexican Americans experienced?
Well, some elements of our community continue to experience terror and oppression. Okay, probably migrants or immigrants, probably more than others, as well as perhaps men. Okay, men who drive, men who are on the street suffer police brutality. When we think about trauma, obviously we have a long history of racial trauma, but I don't think that our community fully understands that lynching was probably the worst terror. The matanza also of the 1910s was also a major traumatic series of events. The KKK were another major terrorist organization. And again, it is not just focused on Blacks. The KKK was in Texas. The KKK was in the Southwest. So let's talk about historical trauma as well as contemporary trauma. And no, I don't know of any studies about that.
Right, okay. You several times in your presentation, J. Louis Sáenz came up, who wrote that book about World War I. Can you give us just an idea of how many Mexican Americans may have been in World War I?
I don't know the number, but I do know there's a couple of studies. There is actually a book, I think it's called To the Line of Fire by Jose Ramirez, which focuses on World War I. I obviously talk about World War I. And then there's a woman named Victoria McDonald that has written a little bit about World War I that's on the internet. But I would hope that we can begin to stop using this ridiculous narrative that we began our civil rights efforts after World War II. We can obviously see that the Order Sons of America and Lulac were here before that, and the same experiences of racism and segregation occurred after World War I and even worse in the 1920s. And we did respond. We did resist. So let's get rid of the World War II narrative, please.
And also, as you mentioned at the beginning, the Mutual Aid Society started even earlier than that.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
yes.
And they were.
Okay, so the Mutual Aid Societies, we have wonderful work by Julie Leninger Picor, and I believe she's a future speaker with you. She, along with Jose Hernandez, have done good studies of the Mutualistas. What we really need are studies of individual Mutualistas in one place over time. And as I mentioned, it's Leninger Picor who mentions that there's 10,000 people in San Antonio involved in the Mutual Aid Societies. Unfortunately, most of those die after the Depression. But Picor actually argues that we continue to have mutual aid efforts. but they have historically been a very important part of our community.
Yeah. Okay, one last question. We have a question from a historian, Dr. Enrique Aleman. What historical parallels between the 1920s and now the 2020s do you see faced by Mexican origin?
Okay, well, that's a hard question. People always want to talk about contemporary times. Well, obviously, we see an attack on voting rights, particularly in Texas. We also see very vocal, blatant racist language being used. It's almost like the idea of the Mexican problem is being reenacted once again in contemporary times. We might also argue that the attack on abortion, many people might feel that that's an attack on our Latinos, particularly those who are poor and do not have means of contraceptions, et cetera, et cetera. Gerrymandering is also something that we're seeing occur over and over again, an increase of that in Texas. So offhand, those are some things. Of course, we don't have the extremities of the racial violence we did. We still have police brutality. And again, in our Latino community, it often does not get the attention that it does in the Black community. But that's a long historical problem. Perales and the Order Sons of America dealt with the racist criminal justice system very thoroughly. So we still have that problem.
Well, we've gone just a little bit over the time, so I want to wrap things up, but I want to say a lot of people in the comments are excited about your Perales book. So I hope you'll come back and talk to us more about Alonso Perales and his legacy, his life and legacy.
I would be happy to do so.
Okay. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Orozco, President Domingo Garcia, and Lulac, Texas State historian David Contreras, as well as AARP for sponsoring tonight's talk. I do want to share that, yes, we actually have later this month talk Mexican Americans and the legacy of the Mutualista movement. That will be October the 21st at 6 o'clock Central, right here, same place as you're watching right now. We hope you can join us again. If you like tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI and how you can support our vision for a national center dedicated to preserving and disseminating Mexican American civil rights history for all by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.